It was a crisp, gray morning in Washington, D.C. when Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General and rising star in the political world, was handed a dossier that would shake the very core of American politics. Bondi had always been a tough, no-nonsense figure, known for her unwavering resolve in bringing justice to those who thought they were untouchable. But even she couldn't have prepared for what she was about to uncover. The documents in front of her outlined a massive, elaborate online scheme involving billions of dollars funneled through seemingly legitimate online businesses. At first glance, it appeared to be just another case of internet fraud, a common issue that law enforcement dealt with every day. But as Pam dug deeper, a shocking truth began to emerge: this wasn't just any scam. It was the largest fraud operation in the history of the United States. And its ties led straight to one of the most controversial figures in Congress, Ilhan Omar. Bondi, with her vast experience in handling high-profile cases, knew that this wasn't a coincidence. The scam involved a network of companies, many of which had connections to offshore accounts, shell companies, and, most importantly, a web of political donors. But what truly set this case apart was the scale. It wasn't just money being stolen, it was an entire digital economy being built on deception. As Bondi began to piece the puzzle together, the weight of the situation became clear. The fraud had cost U.S. taxpayers nearly $200 million, and the scope of the scheme stretched far beyond simple online scams. With every new lead, it became increasingly clear that someone at the top was pulling the strings. And that someone, it seemed, had deep ties to Ilhan Omar's campaign fundraising efforts. Bondi knew that exposing this fraud wouldn't be easy. The political implications were immense, and going after Omar, one of the most prominent progressive voices in Congress, would inevitably spark a firestorm. But there was no turning back now. If the public ever learned the true extent of this operation, the fallout would be catastrophic for both the political establishment and the tech industry. Pam Bondi made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of her career: she was going to bring this conspiracy into the light, no matter the cost. The investigation had only just begun, and the pieces were falling into place. What she didn't know yet was just how deep this rabbit hole went, or how it would explode into one of the biggest scandals in U.S. history. But there was one thing she did know for certain: this was going to be bigger than anything she had ever faced before. Pam Bondi sat in her office late into the night, her desk cluttered with the growing pile of evidence. The dossier had led her to the discovery of several key players in the scheme, individuals and companies that seemed unrelated at first but whose connections soon formed a sinister, intertwined web. It wasn't just fraud on a massive scale, it was a well-oiled operation that had been running for years, quietly siphoning millions from unsuspecting victims. As Bondi scrolled through the names and addresses, a pattern began to emerge. The money trail led to a series of shell companies with ties to offshore accounts, all routed through digital payment platforms that were designed to hide the true identities of those behind the operation. But then came the biggest shock of all. One of the companies involved, a high-tech startup based in Silicon Valley, had received an unusually large sum of venture capital. The company had been listed as a major donor to Ilhan Omar's 2020 campaign, a connection that had been conveniently overlooked by most of the media. According to the financial documents Bondi had gathered, Omar's campaign had received at least $1.5 million in donations from individuals directly linked to the startup. While these donations had been legally reported, the timing of the contributions and the financial connections to the scam seemed too coincidental to ignore. Bondi's instincts kicked in. The fact that this venture capital firm was also linked to the internet fraud operation was no longer a random occurrence, it was the tip of the iceberg. It wasn't just money that was being funneled into political campaigns, it was money that had been stolen from the American people. As she reviewed the documents, one name kept reappearing: Ahmed Al-Rahman, a tech mogul with deep ties to the Middle East. Al-Rahman had established several of the shell companies involved in the scam and was one of the largest financial contributors to Omar's campaign. But what troubled Bondi even more was his connection to a secretive group of investors, many of whom had connections to illegal activities overseas. Could these investors be part of the operation, pulling the strings from behind the scenes? Bondi knew she had to get answers, and quickly. If Ilhan Omar was truly involved, whether knowingly or not, the political fallout would be unprecedented. But getting access to Omar and her team wouldn't be easy. She was a rising star in the Democratic Party, and any attempt to challenge her could quickly be painted as an attack on a Muslim woman of color, a tactic that her supporters would use to rally public opinion against any investigation. However, Bondi had built her career on taking down the untouchables. She wasn't going to back down now. Pam spent the following days in meetings with federal agents, tech experts, and her own legal team. The case was growing more complex by the hour. They needed solid evidence to connect Omar directly to the operation, and the investigation had to be handled with extreme caution to avoid political retaliation. As Bondi worked through the intricacies of the case, one thought kept running through her mind: what if this was bigger than just Ilhan Omar? What if it was part of a larger, more sinister scheme involving other high-ranking politicians and foreign interests? The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a case of political corruption, it was an international conspiracy that could rock the very foundations of American democracy. Pam Bondi's office was becoming a war room. The investigation into the $200 million internet scam, now officially tied to Ilhan Omar's campaign, had consumed her life. Every lead, every document, every phone call was pushing her deeper into the heart of a conspiracy that seemed to grow more dangerous with every passing day. Bondi's team had made an alarming discovery: one of the shell companies linked to the fraud was not only funneling money into Omar's campaign, but it was also engaged in massive money laundering, using high-tech cryptocurrency transactions that were nearly impossible to trace. The company, called WebGulf, had been making waves in Silicon Valley, claiming to be a leader in blockchain technology. But Bondi's investigators had found that behind the facade, WebGulf was a front for a much darker operation. As she sat with her team, looking over the latest intelligence, one fact became chillingly clear: WebGulf's biggest investors were not just tech moguls or venture capitalists. They were people with deep ties to international crime syndicates, groups that specialized in arms dealing, human trafficking, and money laundering. These were the people who had been backing the scam from behind the scenes, using their network of shell companies to funnel stolen funds directly into political campaigns. Bondi's phone rang, cutting through the silence of the room. It was a call she had been expecting but dreading. It was from one of the federal agents working on the case. "We've got something big," the agent said, his voice strained. "We've linked Al-Rahman to a private meeting with Omar just months before the election. It's not just a coincidence anymore. They were in direct contact." The agent's words hit Pam like a ton of bricks. She had suspected there was a connection, but this was something far more concrete. The thought that Omar, a sitting congresswoman, might have been knowingly involved in a criminal operation was almost too much to believe. But now there was evidence. That night, Pam Bondi made the decision to take the case public. She couldn't risk waiting any longer. If the conspiracy was as large as it seemed, and if Omar was truly involved, there was no telling how deep the corruption might run. The public needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. The press conference was set for the following morning. The media had already gotten wind of the investigation, and the buzz was growing louder by the minute. Bondi had spent hours rehearsing, making sure that every word she said would be measured, calculated. She knew the stakes. If Omar had truly participated in this scam, the political ramifications would be devastating. But if she remained silent, she risked allowing this massive fraud to continue unchecked. The following day, Pam Bondi stood at the podium, a sea of cameras flashing in front of her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, adjusted her notes, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to announce the results of an investigation into what could very well be the largest fraud operation in U.S. history. We have uncovered evidence linking a sophisticated $200 million internet scam to a network of shell companies, foreign investors, and high-ranking political figures." The room went silent. "We have traced the funds back to a series of companies that funneled stolen money into the political campaign of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who, it appears, had direct contact with individuals at the center of this operation. The evidence is clear, this was not a case of mere oversight. It was a coordinated effort to launder money and manipulate the political process. The reporters were in an uproar, firing questions faster than Bondi could answer. "Congresswoman Omar has denied any involvement in the past," one reporter shouted. "What evidence do you have to suggest otherwise?" Bondi's response was calm but firm. "We have secured direct evidence of financial ties, along with communications between Omar's campaign and those behind the shell companies. Our investigation is ongoing, and we are working with federal authorities to determine the full extent of this operation." The press conference ended in a frenzy, with reporters scrambling to get more details. Pam Bondi knew that what she had just done would open a floodgate of political chaos. But she also knew it was the right thing. The people deserved to know the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might make the political elite. But what she didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The investigation was far from over, and as more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Bondi would soon realize that there were more powerful players involved than she had ever imagined. The fallout from Pam Bondi's press conference was immediate and intense. As soon as the news hit the airwaves, social media exploded. Hashtags like #OmarScam and #BondiExposesTruth trended within hours, sparking debates that seemed to divide the country. Supporters of Ilhan Omar quickly rallied, accusing Bondi of a politically motivated witch hunt, while her critics began to call for immediate investigations into the allegations. Ilhan Omar, who had been largely silent throughout the initial days of the scandal, finally broke her silence in a fiery press conference of her own. Standing in front of a packed room of reporters, she vehemently denied any wrongdoing. "This is a smear campaign," Omar declared, her voice sharp and unwavering. "I have never been involved in any fraudulent activity, and I will not let these baseless accusations define my work as a congresswoman. Pam Bondi's statements are nothing more than a desperate attempt to discredit me and my colleagues. This is a political attack meant to distract from the real issues facing this country." But while Omar's supporters rallied behind her, many political analysts started to ask tough questions. There was no denying that the evidence presented by Bondi was compelling. The financial links between Omar's campaign and the shell companies were undeniable. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, the question remained, was Omar knowingly involved in the fraud, or was she simply a pawn in a larger, more complex scheme? Pam Bondi spent the following days in damage control mode, working with federal agents and legal teams to track down every lead and prepare for what was sure to be a highly contentious legal battle. But even as the investigation gained momentum, the political forces aligned against her were beginning to make their move. Several prominent members of Congress, many from Omar's own party, called for an immediate congressional inquiry into Bondi's actions. They accused her of overstepping her bounds, and some went so far as to question her motivations. Had she been bribed? Was she trying to make a name for herself at the expense of a sitting congresswoman? The accusations were as dangerous as they were unsubstantiated, but the pressure was mounting. Bondi knew that if she were to stay on course, she would have to continue to gather irrefutable evidence. Every piece of the puzzle had to fit perfectly, and she couldn't afford any mistakes. There were whispers in the media that the investigation was politically motivated, that Bondi was using the fraud case to settle scores or build a case for a future political campaign of her own. But she remained focused, determined to prove that the evidence was the only thing that mattered. One evening, as she reviewed newly uncovered data from a recent raid on one of the shell company offices, a piece of information sent chills down her spine. A set of encrypted emails had surfaced, and they contained communications between Ahmed al-Rahman, the tech mogul at the center of the scheme, and several other individuals tied to foreign intelligence agencies. Among them was an exchange with a high-ranking government official from a nation with long-standing tensions with the United States. The emails were explicit in their content. The individuals involved in the scheme were not just interested in laundering money, they were using the scam to fund covert operations aimed at destabilizing American democracy. The scale of the operation was far more ambitious than anyone had originally thought. This was no longer just about political corruption, it was a calculated attempt to influence the political process and shift the balance of power in Washington. Pam Bondi's heart raced as she read through the emails. This was the smoking gun she had been waiting for, the piece of evidence that could expose the full extent of the conspiracy. But there was a problem. The encryption on the emails was sophisticated, and breaking it would take time. Time that Bondi didn't have. The next day, a bombshell dropped. A high-ranking member of Omar's team, someone who had been with her from the very beginning of her political career, had mysteriously disappeared. The individual, a close advisor named Rashid Khan, had been under investigation for his ties to one of the shell companies. It was suspected that Khan had been the intermediary between Omar's campaign and the criminals behind the scam. His disappearance only added fuel to the fire. Pam Bondi knew the clock was ticking. She had to get to the bottom of this before it spiraled out of control. As the investigation deepened and the stakes grew higher, one thing became clear: the conspiracy was much larger than anyone had imagined, and Omar may have been just the tip of the iceberg. Pam Bondi's pulse quickened as the investigation into the $200 million scam spiraled into a dark, labyrinthine nightmare. The disappearance of Rashid Khan, Ilhan Omar's trusted advisor, had sent shockwaves through the case. Bondi knew that Khan wasn't just an ordinary political advisor, he was the key to unlocking the entire operation. If Khan was involved, and if he had fled to avoid prosecution, it meant that the conspiracy reached even deeper than she had ever imagined. In the days following Khan's disappearance, Bondi's team worked tirelessly to track his last known movements. The evidence was sparse, but a few new pieces began to emerge. Khan had made several secretive trips to foreign countries, including one to a well-known tech hub in Eastern Europe. His connections to a series of shady, untraceable accounts were growing, but one thing was certain: Khan had been the bridge between Omar's campaign and the criminal organizations that had engineered the internet fraud. Bondi's instincts told her that Khan wasn't just running from the law, he was trying to cover up something much larger. There were whispers in the shadows, rumors of foreign intelligence agencies being involved, but nothing concrete yet. The encrypted emails she had discovered were still being analyzed, but Bondi knew that every passing day was bringing them closer to unraveling a web of corruption that stretched across borders and involved some of the world's most dangerous players. The political heat on Bondi was becoming unbearable. Congressional hearings were being called, and members of Omar's party were pulling out every possible stop to discredit her efforts. Media outlets that had once championed Bondi's career were now questioning her motives, suggesting that she might be using this investigation for political gain. Allegations of partisanship were being thrown around, and a smear campaign had begun against her character. But none of it mattered. Bondi knew that she couldn't let herself be distracted. The truth was staring her in the face, and she was determined to expose it. Late one night, Bondi was reviewing some of the last pieces of evidence when her phone rang. It was an encrypted call from a trusted informant inside one of the intelligence agencies. The voice on the other end was urgent. "Pam, you need to listen to me carefully. We found something in the encrypted files. You're not going to like it, but we have confirmation that this fraud wasn't just about money. This operation was designed to compromise U.S. security. The players involved were using these funds to destabilize our government." Bondi's stomach dropped. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made it feel more real than ever before. She had been right all along, the scam was just the surface. This wasn't just about stolen money or political corruption. This was a direct attack on the very foundation of American democracy. The informant continued, "The links between these operatives and foreign governments are undeniable. They've been using American political campaigns as a vehicle to manipulate policy and sway elections. The operation goes all the way to the top." Bondi's mind raced. If foreign governments had been using these schemes to influence American politics, it meant that the investigation had to go beyond Omar. The scope of the operation could be far more widespread, and she needed to act fast. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together. As if on cue, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from one of her legal advisors. The news was staggering. Rashid Khan had been spotted in a remote country known for harboring fugitives, a place with no extradition treaty with the U.S. But there was more. A tip-off had come through that Khan was in possession of vital information, evidence that could bring down the entire conspiracy. If they could find him, they could end this. Bondi knew that this was the moment of truth. If she could get to Khan before the authorities in the foreign country did, she could secure the evidence she needed to expose the entire network. But it wouldn't be easy. Khan was now a fugitive, and finding him would take a level of resources that Bondi couldn't access through conventional channels. The next few days were a blur. Bondi worked around the clock, organizing an operation to locate Khan. The stakes had never been higher, and the pressure was mounting. Every move she made felt like it could be her last, as the investigation grew into a full-blown international crisis. Meanwhile, the political world was watching. Support for Omar had been unwavering from her base, but cracks were beginning to show. Some of her more moderate allies were beginning to distance themselves, questioning the extent of her involvement. Others, however, were doubling down, accusing Bondi of overreaching and fueling a partisan attack. The battle for public opinion had turned into a full-fledged war. Then came the breakthrough. Bondi's team had tracked down one of the key operatives from WebGulf, the tech company at the center of the scheme. This person, who had been on the run for months, was now willing to cooperate in exchange for immunity. The information they provided was invaluable: connections between the shell companies and a vast international network of corrupt politicians, criminals, and foreign operatives. But the biggest revelation came when they uncovered a plan, a coordinated effort to stage a massive cyber attack on the U.S. election infrastructure, funded by the proceeds of the scam. The plot was terrifyingly simple: use the stolen money to fund digital operations that could manipulate voter data, influence election outcomes, and create chaos in the political system. The digital fraud was only the beginning. Bondi was no longer just investigating a scam. She was uncovering a full-blown national security crisis. The weight of the discovery was almost too much to bear. Pam Bondi sat at her desk, staring at the evidence in front of her. The plan was clear now: this wasn't just a criminal operation, it was an attempt to infiltrate and destabilize the very framework of American democracy. The stolen funds from the internet fraud were merely the tip of the iceberg. The true purpose of the operation was far more sinister. With every passing hour, the gravity of what she was uncovering deepened. The coordinated effort to manipulate election infrastructure wasn't just theoretical, it was already in motion. Bondi's mind raced as she processed the latest findings. The operatives behind the scam had gained access to sensitive data related to the upcoming national elections. And, more shockingly, they had the means to exploit vulnerabilities in the nation's voting systems. The implications were staggering. Bondi immediately contacted federal authorities, but as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was unfolding. She wasn't sure how deep this conspiracy went, or who was involved, but the fact that foreign governments were actively targeting U.S. elections made it clear that the stakes had never been higher. The perpetrators weren't just ordinary criminals, they were sophisticated, well-funded, and well-connected, with resources that could disrupt not just the election, but the entire political landscape of the United States. The urgency of the situation became even more apparent when Bondi received an encrypted message from one of her agents. They had received word that Rashid Khan, the fugitive advisor who had information crucial to the case, had been located in a remote village in Eastern Europe. The catch? He was already under the protection of foreign operatives, making it nearly impossible for American authorities to act without risking an international incident. Bondi had no choice but to act quickly and independently. She could not afford to let Khan slip away again, especially after all the progress they had made. There was a plan in motion, one that involved infiltrating an international network of hackers, tech moguls, and political operatives, all working together to control the upcoming election. The decision was made. Bondi would have to travel to Eastern Europe herself. But she wasn't alone in this. As the case grew more dangerous, she called on a few trusted allies, former colleagues and intelligence operatives who had worked with her in the past. They would assist her in the high-stakes mission to track down Khan and secure the evidence she needed. It was an unorthodox move, one that could end her career if anything went wrong. But the threat to national security was so profound that Bondi couldn't let fear dictate her actions. The plane ride was long, and the tension in the air was palpable. As Bondi sat in her seat, the enormity of what she was about to do weighed heavily on her mind. She was no longer just a political figure investigating a case of corruption. She was a player in a global battle for the future of American democracy, with the very real risk of failure looming over her every move. Upon arrival in the foreign country, Bondi and her team immediately began to put their plan into motion. They had intel on Khan's whereabouts, and through a series of covert operations, they managed to infiltrate the compound where he was being held. But this wasn't going to be easy. The compound was guarded by a mix of private mercenaries and foreign operatives who had no intention of letting anyone, especially Americans, get close to their prize. The mission was high risk, but Bondi had no choice. The fate of the upcoming election, and perhaps the stability of the nation itself, rested on securing the information that Rashid Khan held. As Bondi and her team made their way through the compound, they encountered numerous obstacles. A gunfight erupted when one of the mercenaries spotted them, and the tension escalated as they worked their way deeper into the facility. The hours stretched on, with each step more perilous than the last. Bondi had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This was no longer a simple investigation, it was a race against time to prevent a disaster. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bondi and her team reached the room where Khan was being held. He was sitting alone, shackled to a chair, but his eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and defiance when he saw Bondi. He knew why she was there. She knew why he had been kept hidden away for so long. But this wasn't about leverage or negotiation. It was about survival. "I knew you'd come," Khan said, his voice hoarse. "But it's too late. They've already activated the plan. There's nothing you can do now." Bondi's heart raced. "What plan? What are you talking about?" Khan's face tightened. "The cyber attack. The one they've been preparing for months. They've already infiltrated the voting systems. The moment the election begins, they'll control it all. The funds you've been chasing," he paused, swallowing hard. "They're just a part of the operation. It's bigger than you think." Bondi's mind spun. Everything she thought she knew about the operation was now in question. The cyber attack wasn't something they were preparing for, it was happening as they spoke. The forces behind the scam were already executing their plan. Before Bondi could react, the compound erupted into chaos. The mercenaries had realized what was happening and launched a full-scale assault on her team. Gunfire filled the air as Bondi grabbed Khan and made a run for the exit. They had no time to waste. If Khan was right, they were already too late to stop the attack on the election. The gunfire echoed through the narrow corridors of the compound as Pam Bondi, with Rashid Khan in tow, sprinted toward the exit. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step heavy with the realization that the clock was ticking faster than ever. They had no time to waste. The cyber attack that Khan had warned them about was underway, and every second counted. Khan's eyes darted nervously as they ran, his once defiant posture now crumpled under the weight of fear. "You don't understand," he gasped, his breath shallow. "They've already hacked the voting machines. They've planted the code that will disrupt everything. It's too late to stop it now. The election will be rigged by the time anyone notices." Bondi's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what Khan was saying. The moment they had feared was here. The integrity of the upcoming national election, the cornerstone of American democracy, was in jeopardy. A few thousand miles away, in the heart of Washington, D.C., it was all happening in real time. They reached the exit door, and Bondi's team opened fire on the mercenaries that had cornered them, buying them just enough time to make a break for it. The night air was cold as they sprinted across the compound's perimeter and towards the vehicle that was waiting for them. Bondi's pulse thudded in her ears. The mission had now turned from a desperate attempt to gather information into a race to prevent a catastrophe. If they couldn't stop the cyber attack, the outcome of the election, and the very future of the country, would be altered forever. Once they were in the car, the driver slammed the accelerator down. Bondi turned to Khan, her voice sharp with urgency. "You need to tell me everything you know. Right now. Every detail." Khan hesitated, his eyes filled with both fear and regret. "I don't know much more than what I've already said," he confessed, his voice ragged. "The people behind this, they have access to the most advanced technology, and they've been planning this for months. They infiltrated the election software suppliers and manipulated the code to trigger an election night disaster." Bondi clenched her fists, her mind racing. Who's behind this? Who's pulling the strings? Khan shook his head, his face pale. "It's bigger than you think. Some of the world's most powerful people are involved. They want to undermine democracy itself and control the outcome of U.S. elections for their own gain." "Names?" Bondi snapped, her voice cutting through the tension. "Give me names." Khan swallowed hard before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ahmed al-Rahman. He's one of the key players. He's been coordinating with foreign intelligence agencies. And there are others, politicians, business leaders, international figures. They've been orchestrating this from behind the scenes, but I don't know who all of them are." Bondi's mind reeled as the implications of Khan's words sank in. Al-Rahman, the tech mogul at the heart of the scam, was not just a criminal, it seemed he was a part of a much larger, global conspiracy. A conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, both in the US and abroad. The car sped through the darkened roads, Bondi's mind spinning with new information. They needed to act fast. The cyber attack was already in progress, and with every minute that passed, more and more voting systems would be compromised. The American people wouldn't even know what hit them until it was too late. Back at headquarters, Bondi's team had been working tirelessly to trace the source of the hack. They had gained access to the system's entry points but were still struggling to identify exactly how the attackers were executing the breach. But the situation was growing dire, and there was only one option left: Bondi needed to get to Washington, D.C., and bring the fight to the heart of the government. By the time they reached the airport, Bondi's team had set up a secure line to the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. As she boarded a private jet with Khan in tow, she was already planning her next move. She couldn't stop the attack from overseas, but if she could get back to the States in time, maybe she could rally the right people to intervene before it was too late. On board, she was contacted by one of her top analysts. "Pam, we've got a breakthrough. The hackers left behind a traceable entry point into the system, and we believe we can counteract the code they've installed. But we'll need full access to the election infrastructure immediately. Time is running out." Bondi's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. They might have a chance to stop this. But then, another bombshell came through on her encrypted line. The message was brief, but the weight of it was immense. "We have confirmation. Ilhan Omar is in communication with key figures behind the cyber attack. She's not just a victim here, she's actively coordinating with them." Bondi felt her blood run cold. Everything she had thought she knew was now in question. Omar's role in the fraud operation suddenly seemed even more sinister. She had been involved in the scam from the beginning, but now, it appeared that she had taken a more active role in the conspiracy to sabotage the election itself. Bondi clenched her jaw. She wasn't just going to take down the fraudsters anymore, she was going to bring down the entire network, no matter where it led. The jet soared into the night sky, and Bondi steeled herself for the battle ahead. The clock was ticking, and America's future was hanging by a thread. It was all or nothing. The night had grown darker, but for Pam Bondi, it had never been more urgent. As the private jet sped towards Washington, D.C., her mind raced with the weight of what she was about to confront. With every passing minute, the enormity of the conspiracy she was uncovering became more apparent. It was no longer just a simple case of election fraud or political corruption, it was an all-out attack on American democracy itself. As the plane descended toward the Capitol, Bondi's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the Department of Homeland Security. They had found the hackers responsible for the breach. The operation was in full swing, and the perpetrators were on the verge of triggering the final phase of the cyber attack that would manipulate voter data and compromise the election results. "We have seconds to act," Bondi muttered under her breath. But there was still the question of Ilhan Omar's involvement. The revelation that she was in direct contact with the conspirators had turned everything upside down. Omar was no longer just a politician at the center of a scandal, she was now part of a much larger, more dangerous game. The plane touched down on the tarmac at D.C. International Airport, and Bondi's team was already on the ground, preparing for the final push. With Khan still in custody, she knew they had one last chance to stop the cyber attack. But the stakes had never been higher. She had to confront the very people who had orchestrated this scheme, and at the top of the list was Ilhan Omar. Within minutes, Bondi was escorted to a secure location, where representatives from the FBI, Homeland Security, and the National Security Agency had already gathered. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the urgency palpable. Everyone knew that time was running out. "We have confirmation," an NSA agent said, his voice grim. "The hack is set to launch in less than 30 minutes. If we don't act now, the results of this election will be permanently compromised. We've traced the source of the attack, but we need full access to the voting infrastructure. And we need it fast." Bondi nodded, her mind already turning over the next steps. They needed to stop the hackers, and they needed to arrest the key players involved in orchestrating the attack. The team had gathered all the evidence they needed to charge those involved, but the question remained, would they be able to intercept the final phase of the cyber attack in time? As Bondi's team worked furiously to gain access to the election infrastructure, she made a call to Omar's office. The response was immediate, but chilling. "I have nothing to say to you, Pam," Omar's voice was cold over the line. "You've already made your accusations. There is no conspiracy here, just your attempt to discredit me and my work. You're chasing shadows." Bondi could feel the coldness of Omar's words seep into her bones. Omar wasn't backing down. She knew something Bondi didn't. Maybe she thought she had too much protection, too many allies in high places to ever be touched. But the truth was closing in on her, and Bondi wasn't about to let her slip away. "I'm coming for you, Ilhan," Bondi replied, her voice steely with resolve. "You can't hide from the truth." With that, she cut the call. The investigation had now reached its final, explosive stage. Bondi's team had made significant progress in thwarting the cyber attack, and they had located the servers that housed the malicious code that could derail the entire election process. The countdown was getting dangerously close. Just then, an encrypted message arrived on Bondi's secure line. The news was as alarming as it was unexpected. "We have confirmed Ilhan Omar's direct involvement in the final stages of the cyber attack. She's with the operatives now. If we don't act in the next few minutes, she'll trigger the attack herself." Bondi's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. It was no longer about saving the election, it was about stopping a betrayal of the highest order. Ilhan Omar, a sitting congresswoman, had crossed a line that few could even fathom. A tactical team was dispatched to intercept Omar, but Bondi knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. The operation had to be precise and swift. Minutes later, they arrived at a secure location in the heart of Washington. Omar's movements were being tracked, and the final confrontation was imminent. Bondi's team stormed the building, overwhelming the security and forcing their way inside. The tension was electric as they reached the room where Omar was. But what they found was not what they expected. Omar was standing in front of a computer, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, poised to execute the final command that would initiate the cyber attack. She didn't flinch as Bondi entered the room, her gaze steely and resolute. "You were too late," Omar said, her voice cold, almost triumphant. "You think you can stop this? The game's already been played. The future is already in motion." Bondi stepped forward, her face hardening with determination. "It's not over yet, Ilhan. You've lost." Omar's eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and anger. But before she could react, Bondi's team had secured the system, cutting off access to the malicious code. The countdown was halted, and the cyber attack was neutralized. They had won, just in time. As the dust settled, Omar was arrested and taken into custody. The full extent of her involvement in the conspiracy would soon be laid bare for the public to see. The election had been saved, but the fallout from the scandal would be felt for years to come. In the aftermath, Pam Bondi stood before the press, her face impassive as she briefed the nation on the successful operation. She knew that this was a victory, but it was bittersweet. The political world would never be the same again. The forces that had tried to undermine the very heart of democracy had been stopped, but at a cost. Bondi had gone through hell to get here, but she had done what was necessary to protect the future of the United States. The battle was won, but the war for the truth was far from over.